Good afternoon and welcome to this panel on Nordic Baltic security. My name is Matthias Aseros and I will be your moderator today. This seminar is organized by the Axel Johnson Foundation in collaboration with the Changing Character of War program at Oxford University. We're very happy to be here at FPA. This seminar will deal with the security situation of the Nordic Baltic countries in an era which is marked by uncertainty. The 45th President of the United States, Donald Trump, has been vague on his commitment to Article 5 and comes across as ambiguous in relation to Russia. And at the same time in the United Kingdom, political turmoil and a weak government have created momentum for the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, a skeptic of NATO and an advocate of reduced defence spending and minimal overseas involvement. And in Sweden and in the Nordic countries, we are trying to grasp a security situation that day by day becomes more complex and difficult to read. But we have a very distinguished panel to help us make sense of the situation. We have James Kirchick. He's a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution in DC. He's a widely published journalist and the author of The End of Europe, Dictators, Demagogues, and the Coming Dark Age. From sunny California, from sunny California, we have Commander David M. Slayton. He's a research fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. And during his Navy career, Slayton completed 12 combat deployments, to include commanding the largest US Navy combat unit in Afghanistan in 2009. And from the UK, we have Dr. Robert Johnson. He's a director of the Changing Character of War program at Oxford University. He's also a widely published war historian and a former officer of the UK Army, who's also actually been deployed in Afghanistan. Last but not least, we have Charly Salonius Pasternak. He's a research fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, and he has also just ended an Axel Johnson visiting fellowship at the Changing Character of War program in Oxford. These excellent speakers will now help us get beyond the headlines and the Twitter feeds and answer that elegant questions once put forward by President Trump. What the hell is going on? I now give the floor to James Kirchick.
Thank you very much. I think there's been a lot of noise about Donald Trump, and I should start this out by saying I was a strong critic of him. I am a very strong critic of him. That said, I don't think that the worst fears that those of us who opposed him becoming president had, they have not come to fruition. We were talking about the end of NATO. We were talking about some sort of alliance with Russia. And 6 months into the presidency, we've seen the expansion of NATO into Montenegro. We've seen a strike, a military strike against the Syrian regime, an ally of Vladimir Putin, something that did not happen throughout the years of the Obama presidency. There has not been this sort of nightmare scenario that those of us who criticize Donald Trump imagined. That said, there hasn't been a crisis yet. And there's multiple opportunities for crisis, and I think knowing the temperament of this president, which I think is a very problematic situation, I very much worry about a crisis. That said, he has surrounded himself with some good advisors. Most prominent among them is the Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, his National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster. And it seems at this point that he appears to be taking their advice. What I would like to see from President Trump is at least an acknowledgement that Russia is a problem, that Russia is an adversary of the United States, that it is an adversary of our allies, that it is a problem, that it causes problems, and that we are not going to be able to, as he puts it, get along with this country as long as Vladimir Putin is still in power. He seems to be laboring under this delusion, really, in my opinion, that we can get along with Russia. And I don't think that that's possible for the United States if we're not willing to sacrifice our values or our interests. I cannot understand how it's possible to get along with this regime. So there's a lot riding on the meeting coming up at the G20 between President Trump and President Putin. I worry about this meeting because I think President Putin clearly knows what he wants to get out of it. He is a lifetime KGB officer. He's very good at psychological profiles of people. This is what he's been doing his entire life, and I'm not really sure that Donald Trump has an understanding of what he expects to get out of this meeting with Vladimir Putin other than adulation from him. What I'm really worried about is not so much, I know the topic of this talk is security in the Baltics, and I'm not an expert on this part of the world, so I can only give you the view of American foreign policy. What I'm concerned about is what Secretary Mattis has said, actually. The thing that worries him most is domestic partisanship in the United States. It's not the North Korean crisis, it's not Vladimir Putin. It is the increasing partisanship in the United States, the inability for us to agree on basic things, the inability for us to have a civil conversation with one another. This is a really serious problem in a democracy. And it's really bad right now. If you just look at the way people talk to one another, the lack of consensus on basic things, the state of political debate in the United States, this is a really serious issue over the long term. And it's actually wonderful to come to this country and to come to this event, which I've never been to before, which I really think is a model of respectful, civil dialogue, and something that we in the United States could perhaps take a lesson from. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. David, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Good afternoon. I'd like to start off with saying that the views I express today are my own, not that of the United States government. I'm not with the government or the United States Navy. I see we have a broad swath of representation here in the audience, from General Hodges to some locals, and I hope from people from across Europe. And I say that because I hope that I provoke some good conversation on this topic. And what I'd like to start out with is a compare and contrast of what we've seen happen in Ukraine, and more than likely what's on the minds of the people here in the Nord-Baltic region, particularly in the Baltics. I see four common themes that can be applied to both sides. One, at its heart, in my opinion, the crisis in Ukraine is purely rooted in energy and energy distribution without question. Second, we have the exploitation and the leveraging of a legacy ethnic Russian population in Ukraine. Third, we see an influence and an interference in legitimate political processes within Ukraine that has led to the current situation. And then finally, we have a dedicated exploitation of all those factors combined with information warfare and cyber warfare. All those four tenets are at play not only within Ukraine, but in any part of the world where Russia has some type of interest. The difference between what's happening in Ukraine and what potentially could happen, say, in the Baltics is NATO. Russia is not going to employ the same type of irregular warfare. They're not going to employ the same type of hard power. They're not going to employ the same type of tactics, techniques, and procedures with armed forces in the Baltic. They know better. It's not going to happen. That being said, what can we expect to see in a country that's covered by Title V in NATO? We're going to see more insidious application of the four items that I mentioned before, and I'll highlight the exploitation of legitimate political means within a sovereign country and the continual application of information warfare and cyber warfare to achieve those political objectives within another sovereign country. We've seen that within the United States, this type of exploitation and interference in a legitimate political process. And that's what I think we all have to be aware of here in Europe, within the United States, and worldwide, this type of interference from Russia. How do we effectively counter Russian aggression, and particularly when it's based within energy and energy distribution? And that is the common theme here in Europe that should concern all of us and things we should address. And that's the type of questions that I want to be able to drive from Matisse and from the audience going forward. With that, I'll turn it over.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm always delighted, as someone from the United Kingdom, that my European friends are at least still talking to me after recent political changes, I'm delighted to be here and have the opportunity to talk with you. You'll be pleased. I'm going to do this in two parts in the interest of brevity. Part one, you won't be at all surprised by. It's a continuation of Britain's commitment to the defence of Nordic and Baltic countries as part of a joint expeditionary force, part of NATO, seeing this region as important to United Kingdom national interests. The second part of what I'm going to say is going to shock you and probably offend you. So let's just go with this. So first of all, United Kingdom national interests are totally unchanged. The current government sees its wider interests as being the support of its democratic and liberal values, and that its alliance partners who endorse those political values it will support, as it has done consistently throughout the Cold War years up to the present. Its NATO commitment is firm. The United Kingdom is one of the few countries that does actually spend the 2% of GDP, which has been promised by NATO members. It does have some doubts about some of its allies that have moved either far to the left or in Europe at the moment far to the right. And one of those NATO partners I will name, which is Turkey, which is causing Britain considerable anxiety. Regardless of Brexit, yes, that word has appeared, it does seem to me that while Britain will be forging new economic partnerships with the rest of the world, it would seem pretty absurd that it would not continue to trade very actively with the European countries, because about 40% of the UK economy is based on its commerce with its most immediate neighbours. So as far as the UK is concerned at the moment, its ways and means and its ends are consistent. It has maritime power, which it wishes to project. It's building 2 new aircraft carriers, both of which will be deployed in the high north, possibly not in the Baltic. It has a continuous at-sea nuclear deterrent, an independent nuclear deterrent with which to face down any threat from a country to the east of this one, which may feel, I don't mean Finland, which means that it will be seeing off any threats to this region from that point of view. It has currently rapid reaction brigades, air mobile and amphibious, to deploy anywhere in this region. It's very, very firmly committed to coalitions, as it's proved over the last 20 years or so. It's got a joint forces command, a standing joint force headquarters. It's part of the Joint Expeditionary Force and fits in with the combined Joint Expeditionary Force run by the United States. It's deployed forces forward into the Baltic states and also into Poland. It has a cyber command, which it's just stood up, and it has 7 Brigade, a military intelligence force designed to combat information warfare, alongside GCHQ and its intelligence listening station. So at the moment, it looks pretty good from a UK support to Sweden and the neighbouring states' point of view. The problem is, it's all going to change this autumn. And this brings to my second part of the talk. At the moment, we anticipate that there will be another general election in the autumn of this year. It is quite likely that the person that will succeed to power will be Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn is on record as wishing to dismantle NATO. Certainly he wishes Britain to leave that force. He wishes to reduce the British Army down to a local defence militia. He wishes to remove its independent nuclear deterrent. He wishes to stop all expeditionary air operations, including those currently over Syria and Iraq. In other words, if Jeremy Corbyn comes to power, within 2 years, Britain will cease to be a major military contingent, and the open left flank of this country will be broadly exposed. Now, in addition to this reduction of military capacity, we should also bear in mind something else about this particular political leader. He is very keen on the concept of appeasement. He thinks that with Russia, you can't possibly confront them, and therefore any threat posed by Russia or any new assertiveness will simply be given way on the basis that diplomacy will allow it to take its course. And his own party feel that actually the Baltic republics aren't terribly important to his party's fortunes. So what we have had in terms of homeland security of the United Kingdom and an expeditionary posture could potentially come to an abrupt end. And I'm telling you this as a friend of European countries to say you need to get prepared for this possibility, this eventuality. The final thing to say is to reinforce a point made by David, which is that threats today are posed internally to states rather than territorially and externally. And by that I mean that the biggest threat posed to all of our countries in the Western world at the moment are political movements, sometimes funded by outsiders, who wish to reduce the capacity for us to conduct normal democratic politics. We have in Britain a number of extremist groups and parties who have set themselves the task of dismantling the current political system for their own ends. When you try to inquire where they get their funding from, you are met with a number of blank stares. On that, I'll leave it.
Right. Great. Thank you. I'm going to try to reflect on a few quick things here, and then I've struck one of my points, and we'll have two left. Jamie's comment about Trump not being as bad, or things not being as bad, my key worry is the crisis component. What credibility does the White House have? How would it be used? So if there is a military or civilian escalation in this region, is anyone going to believe the White House? Whether or not the White House says, no, we have no idea who these green men are, or the opposite. I leave you to think about which one it may be. I agree, it's exploitation of existing fissures, which again goes to us needing to, in Finland, Sweden, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, spend all the more time and effort to ensure that there's debate, but debate doesn't go over into broader fissures. Nordic Baltic security. It's clearly tied to regional security as well as transatlantic security. So a few thoughts on that, and then things to do. Transatlantic security, as I've written on a lot of occasions, is rather safe, even from a somewhat unstable US president. The reason for that is it's institutional, and it has an institution in NATO. This is not going to be erased. Of course, the US president can, at the margins, impact this. He can get us to question whether or not Article 5 would actually be operationalized. But in terms of the daily relations, no, I don't think he can. On the EU side, again, we've heard there's going to be increased cooperation. In Finland, I keep on telling people, this applies to Sweden too, when in the EU they talk about defense cooperation, it is not defense how we understand it. It is about industrial cooperation, crisis management, and potentially helping out in some other ways. It is not national territorial defense. Don't fall into that trap. More importantly, though, I think EU, NATO, as well as individual countries, Britain, US, have realized the importance of regional cooperation, where getting operational stuff done matters more. Jeff for Britain, Finland and Sweden cooperating bilaterally, as well as then the clear increase in US efforts and exercises with Finland and Sweden, as well as in the Baltics. Getting actual operational cooperation, interoperability, rather than planning about maybe doing something, which tends to unfortunately be the EU way. So what to do then? First, some military thoughts, and then broader. Increase national defense preparations. This is to reduce the threshold. I can say this, and I presume almost everyone here would like the people in uniform never actually to have to use it and their skills for defense of our countries. But this is necessary to reduce the overconfidence that I think we're seeing emanate from Russia. To try to suggest you think you're on a winning streak from Crimea and Syria, do not come here. Another part is increasing popular support. It turns out national service is really useful for this in many different ways. It's also operationally useful because, again, it turns out that reservists have skills that a regular military, all-volunteer force never could actually get together and pay for. 77 Brigade is an attempt to kind of, in some ways, make up for this and get civilian expertise in. Deepen regional cooperation I talked about. market things well. It's quite clear that the White House sees how things are presented as being more important than maybe how they are. I'm really glad that in Finland, finally, Defense Forces, Defense Ministry said, okay, let's count our GDP spending the way NATO does. And immediately, without us actually doing anything, we got about 0.4% increase. Then start explaining what you get out of it, what you can contribute. This, I think, is key. And then I'll wrap up with something I was researching actually when I was at CCW, which is everyone's talking about full spectrum conflict, a state using all of their tools that they can for political ends. Some use the word hybrid. I really dislike it, but I understand it's in the political vernacular, so we have to. To meet this, you need a societal security concept, which in Sweden was born as totalförsvar, total defense. Redevelop it, but less from a defense point of view. Defense is one part of it. In Finland, I'd argue maybe it's a seventh or an eighth of the totality. Here's where the tricky bit comes. It's fairly easy to get two army companies or Navy units to cooperate. There's a parallel similarity between them. It's a lot harder to get banks or telcos, let's say, to cooperate across border. Yet this is what you have to do. So getting cooperation in this full spectrum environment is necessary, but really, I would say, much harder to do than on a straight military side. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I want to first, my first question here is something we also touched upon here in the panel, and that is the individuals. So we're talking about Putin, we're talking about Trump, also Corbyn is now, we now sort of speak of him as a as a world leader. I don't know if we're there yet, but I want to know, how important is the relationship between these individuals now on the political stage? How much is still deep state? How much is individuals? How much can they change? We can start with you, James.
I think the individuals matter, but I think something we've learned perhaps over the past 6 months is, to our benefit, that the President of the United States or the Chancellor of Germany, they don't control the country. There are lots of institutions, there are lots of relationships that exist beyond the reach of that office. And I think all the other speakers said that, on the day-to-day operational level, relations between the United States and its allies in NATO are continuing. And you might have, the Chancellor giving a speech a couple months ago where she said, we can't depend on America and Britain as we have in the past. At the end of the day, though, I'm not sure yet that, 6 months into this presidency, we can say that it's the end of the, Atlantic world. It's the end of American leadership. I'm not sure that we're there yet.
Yeah, David, can you?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to build on a point that James made earlier, and what we see today in the Twitter sphere every day from the President of the United States. And I would just urge folks in Europe to look past the words on Twitter and look to the deeds. And I'll highlight two items of recent occurrence. The first is a set of new sanctions proposed by the Senate on the 14th of June, which are specifically targeted at Nord Stream 2, which is a gas distribution network that's flowing out of Russia into Germany and onto Austria, bypassing Ukraine. So these sanctions are very targeted. They're meant to isolate the distribution network from Russia into Europe, meant to apply additional economic pressure. And for a state like Russia, which has a non-diversified economy, wholly dependent on petrochemical extraction, and not much more, very horrible demographics. This is a very, very pinpointed, very effective way to influence Russia's behavior on the international stage. The second thing I'd like to point out is President Trump's visit to Poland on the 6th of July, where he's going to highlight and fully endorse the 3 Cs proposal, which is the combined efforts, energy, extraction, and distribution from the Adriatic, the Baltic Sea, and the Black Sea. Again, this is one way to create better interdependencies between our friends and allies for energy distribution, And again, further, if we look at markets, both gas and oil markets worldwide, and why we've seen this precipitous decline in oil and gas prices, it's not necessarily because of supply. It's because of the robust distribution networks that we now see worldwide by land and by sea. And the more robust those distribution networks are, the more resilient they are to geopolitical and geostrategic change, the more resilient they are to conflict, and it produces certainty in the market, which is going to continue to put downward pressure on those commodities worldwide and for natural gas regionally. So that is yet another tool that the West has to use against Russia, and I think that's something we need to look at. So again, focus on the deeds, not the words of President Trump in the United States, and I think you'll come away with a far different perspective than you can get from Twitter.
I think it was Max Weber who said that the purpose of bureaucracy is to prevent leaders from getting it entirely wrong. And actually, we elect our leaders and hope that they get it right. And what we do is we find they increasingly get it wrong. David Cameron, there'll be an election, an in-out election for Europe. We're bound to win it, he said, and he lost it. Theresa May said, we'll have a snap election. That'll give us a landslide, so we're strong and stable leadership to confront the European Union through negotiations. Got that wrong. Apparently Jeremy Corbyn is promising a new Jerusalem, a new utopia for England. You've never had it so good is what he thinks he'll be saying it by 2020. In fact, I'd be surprised if we ever get that far. I think the interesting thing is that, when it comes to individual statesmen, we talk a lot about Donald Trump's inexperience in office and the contrast with Vladimir Putin as a very experienced political operator. And I think often the bogeyman of Putin is invoked, but actually we should be much more mindful of the rather cynical manner in which he manipulates people to achieve his ends. He wishes to change policies in Western countries by manipulating the politics of those countries. That is far more serious, and it isn't the knock-around, hilarious histrionics of Donald Trump, nor is it the British shooting themselves in both feet and then, as of the autumn, shooting themselves in the head. It is actually a far more subtle and scary form of international politics.
I guess I then have to say, I agree, look at deeds, but words do matter, especially when they come from the US president. My comment would actually be to another leader, the Finnish president Niinistö, because for a while he was reviled after Crimea for actually going and talking with Putin. Now it seems to be fairly normal that it's acceptable to do this. But this meant that for a while he was the one world leader who had spoken with Putin, come to Helsinki, and then fly and meet Obama. It just so happens that Xi Jinping, before he went to Mar-a-Lago, also flew through Helsinki and spoke with Niinistö. I don't know if he got any directions or suggestions, but there is a value to dialogue. And lest anyone be concerned that Finland thinks we're just going to have dialogue, the other part we do is defense and deterrence, because we clearly know where our only existential threat could come from.
Charly, you spoke of the overconfidence from Russia. So has your confidence changed over the past decade, and why is that?
Has Russian overconfidence?
Yeah, you spoke about overconfidence.
I would suggest so. They're better experts at it here, but looking at actions as well as words, even in some cases, playing this game of you, the audience, know I'm lying, I know I'm lying, and I don't care. Which is a rather insidious form of overconfidence. But of course, I have to give points. Syria, Russia is now at the table, maybe even guiding it for a relatively small, not easy, but a relatively small military, political, operational price. And this can't help but have an impact. There's also a concern by some of the Russia experts I talked to regarding how much contrary opinion Putin gets. Does Putin have a McMaster and a Mattis? It may be, and we simply don't know about it, but in the public, it's not as obvious.
Rob, does Russia have the upper hand?
Well, I think, what's interesting about Russian policy is, they have a very understandable position. Their policy line from the late 1990s through to about 2008 was very understandable. Restoration of national morale, restoration of the national economy, and so on. But I think what we've seen is Russia reaching a sort of turning point in policy where their military modernization program is underway. They have already conducted, as far as they're concerned, successful military operations, both ground and air, in eastern Ukraine and in Syria. And so they've reached what sociologists and sort of political scientists would call the overconfidence moment. Now, when you reach that particular threshold, it tends to give rise to much more aggressive policies. I don't mean assertive policies, I mean aggressive policies. And it seems to me that as the American presidency reaches its midterms, and traditionally American politicians tend to become a little more pusillanimous at that point, we are like to have a perfect storm, a coincidence of Russian military preparedness and aggression, Europeans being inadequately defending themselves because of complacency about their sort of coalition and how this arrangement will somehow defend themselves, precisely at the moment of this American sort of withdrawal, not in physical sense, but sort of in terms of less willingness to engage with overseas expeditionary warfare. That could be a perfect storm. And by the way, the date, ladies and gentlemen, is between 2018 and 2020.
I'd like to pick up on a couple of points that Rob made. And in this day, right now, Russia's greatest threats are all internal, and Putin knows that. So this projection or the perception of overconfidence, I believe, is real. And likewise, to build on that point further, right at the point where they're going to be achieving the maximum amount of readiness they have in their recapitalization, they're also going to be feeling the maximum economic effects of a depressed oil and gas market. So they're going to be very tightly constrained economically. Their demographics within Russia also is a big negative. You know, the life expectancy of a male in Russia is 63 years old, and that's all due to lifestyle. They have a negative fertility rate. Their land mass that they need to control and influence is not getting any smaller, and they definitely don't have too many friends on their border. So for a country whose top 5 threats are really internal, they're going to be doing everything they can to control their internal messaging, to try to keep a lid on their own population, to try to maintain what little influence they do have through economic and military means and other means of power. That said, I don't think it's anyone's best interest to have it destabilize Russia. And going forward, I think as their neighbors, it bears close witness to see what happens, and likewise, to keep an eye on the economic interdependencies they have with Russia's friends and allies going forward.
A poll was just conducted, and it showed that Russians believe Joseph Stalin to be the greatest figure in history, not just the greatest Russian in history, the greatest figure in history. And this, I think, tells you so much. I think the way a country approaches its past is very crucial to understanding how it behaves in the present. And I think if Russians, as a people, viewed Stalin in the same way that Germans of today view Hitler, we wouldn't have many of the problems that we have with Russia. And you look at a country like Germany, which obviously committed unspeakable crimes, came to terms with this past, and now no one fears Germany, at least militarily. And Germany's, I think, the most respected country in the world, according to a BBC poll. And you contrast the relationship between Germany and its neighbors today, where all of Germany's neighbors have friendly relations, and they want to have closer relations, and they trade. They send their students there to learn German. And you compare that relationship, those sets of relationships, with those of Russia's neighbors, not a single one of whom, I believe, doesn't lie in fear at night about their neighbor to the east. So this is a very ominous development, I think, in Russia, is the rewriting of history over the past decade. And I think it's a very serious phenomenon that we have to be aware of.
Thank you. 2 more questions before we go into to audience questions. I want to go back to the role of the individuals. And we mentioned Jim Mattis. It comes back over and over again. And he's become a big name now also in the media. So we'd like to start with you, David. You met a man several times. What is his role, and how important is he to the administration right now?
Well, not to speak for Secretary Mattis, but I'm very glad that both he and General McMaster both came from the Hoover Institution into the current administration. I think you'll continue to find a very pragmatic approach, a very reflective approach to the policy he informs and advises the president going forward. It's based on a broad sense of experience. It's based on a healthy sense of history. It's based on a deep respect for intellectual application of thought. And it's also based on, I would say, a pragmatic and realistic view of the world. And I think that's what we're going to continue to see going forward.
Rob, from a UK perspective, how do you view Mattis?
I've not a great deal to say, but I think I would endorse what David said. It sounds like an echo chamber, but I think it's absolutely right what he said. And I think actually we're well served by General H.R. Mamasa too, because in my personal experience, the gentleman, I'm sure he won't mind me saying this, that he will be very eager to assert the policy line that should be adopted. He will rationalise that. He will lay that out logically in a sort of very combative sort of way. And I'd be very surprised if the president gets his way if General H.R. disagrees with him. I think that's, and what we can say is that General Jim Mattis will adopt a fairly quiet approach, but equally determined. Still waters run deep, as they say.
I think we saw an example of that on the issue of torture, where throughout the campaign, Donald Trump had endorsed torture and said we should do worse things and waterboarding and whatnot. And then he had a meeting apparently with Secretary Mattis, who said, well, just give me a six-pack and a carton of cigarettes or something, and I can get whatever information I need out of someone. And like that, Trump had changed his mind. Or he didn't change his mind, but he said, well, I still believe in torture, but I'm going to defer to, I'm going to defer to Secretary Mattis on this. So that was an example of how, even on something that throughout the campaign he had so strongly defined himself on, how he can be persuaded. And for a man who seems so stubborn, there are actually some things where the advice he gets from people whom he respects can have an impact.
So I want to ask you now the final question before we go into the questions from the audience. Name one thing that needs to be done right now in order to protect the security of the Nordic Baltic region. And we start with Charly.
Lots of thinking time. One thing that
there's only one thing.
One thing that needs to be done. I'll hit on the if we're going to continue increasing military cooperation, that's wonderful. I just heard about Aurora 17 here in Sweden, which includes U.S. and Finland. But force other authorities to cooperate. It is not just a military question. Get other authorities to really practice, exercise, and plan together, because just military preparation isn't going to be enough.
I think it was Vladimir Ilyich Lenin who said, what is to be done in 1983? And look at where that got him. To add to this idea about military preparedness, and I'm sure others will talk about diplomacy, I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think critical thinking is what we need right now. In 1914, in the summer of 1914, people said there'll be no war in Europe because the bankers won't allow it. And we're in a situation here in Europe, and I say this as a British person sort of about to be ex-Europe, apparently, that we've become very complacent about our continent. Yes, financial crises, migration flows, and so on. But actually, we're very complacent because we think we have all the answers. We think we've done World War II, we've done the Cold War, it's going to be fine, diplomacy will work. Well, actually, sometimes it doesn't. And the job of academics is to do some critical thinking and to think the unthinkable. And we had a thought experiment earlier today, and indeed last night, talking about the advantages for Russia to advance onto Kiev in the next 12 months. Now, if you stop and think about that critically for a moment, most people would say to me, that is absurd, that runs the risk of a major continental European war. Does it? Would the Europeans really resist? Would the United States commit military forces to such a resistance? Would it not seal the authority of Vladimir Putin at a moment when his individual leadership may be becoming a bit more shaky? Would it not actually restore the old Soviet borders and therefore create a buffer zone for Russia? Would it not humiliate the West, which is actually his primary objective in order to restore this idea of Russian power? And would it not resolve the ongoing irresolvable conflict in the Donbass? So my job is to think unthinkable things, and I would hope that I can empower others to do some critical thinking and to consider some of these options.
That's why I like having Rob to my right, so you can consider those things. To your question, there's been a considerable amount of research done that shows that the number one determining factor of the success of any economy, of any cohort, of any group of people is the amount of electricity available per capita for any cohort. And to that end, to directly answer your question, I think that the one thing that is going to secure the security and stability of Eastern and Northern Europe is to diversify the supply of natural gas for point electricity generation to other sources and away from Russia.
The president finally came out and endorsed Article 5, but it was a very tortured, long process. And I think the ambiguity that has been created about this is very troubling. I would like to see a presidential visit, perhaps, to this region, the Baltic states. And President Obama went to Tallinn and gave a speech where he very explicitly said that the defense of Tallinn, Riga, and Vilnius is no different than the defense of Rome, Paris, and Berlin. And I think a similar sort of message from this president would be much welcomed.
Good. We have time for a couple of questions from the audience. One over there.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask, do you see any feasible way to de-escalate, let's say, the Russian and Putin's aggression? Okay.
Yeah. Are we?
You heard the question?
Yeah.
Yes.
I think the Russians understand strength. And I think that there was a story in the Washington Post about a week ago about the Obama administration's response to the election meddling last year. People seem to forget this now, but the reason why Vladimir Putin did what he did in our election last summer was because he knew that he would be able to get away with it, based upon the policy of the Obama administration over 8 years, which was weak and feckless, beginning with the reset, 6 months after the invasion and occupation of Georgia, when we rewarded the Russians with the reset, all the way through to the invasion and annexation of Crimea. And you could even go further to the military involvement in Syria. The Russians were able to get away with everything. And a lot of Democrats in the United States now who've suddenly become cold warriors all of a sudden seem to be forgetting the policies of the last administration. So I think the Russians only understand strength. And so whether it's military strength, whether it's diplomatic strength, that is the message that we need to send. And that will be the best way of de-escalating any sort of tensions that we have with them.
I'll just add to the showing strength. Yes, but even on the military side, it doesn't always have to be public. In fact, sometimes it's very useful that only the other actors with sensors in the region know, now the Finns got serious. But it doesn't have to be public always, which is something just to consider both for the people doing it as well as all of you.
Absolutely. I'd like to build on the two previous points. I think an overt show of resolve, for example, with the quick reaction force through the Baltics by the NATO countries and a continual refreshing and a rotation of those forces, the Marine contingent that remained in Norway longer than the exercise period, those small shows of force, I think, are important, but they need to be backed up by deeper resolve, not only by the United States, but our partners and allies as well. I think that those two things coupled together on a consistent, regular, and enduring basis will be the check to the question you asked, sir.
Two responses reaching back to history from Winston Churchill, who said, "When short of troops, put out more flags," to show that you've got a resolve. And also he said that there was one better thing than more war, and that's more jaw. And I suspect that probably the answer is to have a conversation with Vladimir Vladimirovich and say to him, what is it that you want? And is there another way of getting there other than confronting the very countries that could work with you for a greater good?
One more question from PJ.
PJ Anders Linder. Robert, you mentioned the European complacency, NATO's 2% target. At present, I think there are 4 countries maybe who reached that target, UK among them. in Europe. Do you see any likelihood that big European countries like Germany or France will even approach that level in the foreseeable future?
Sadly, no, I don't. And I think in part because, as we've already just heard over the last few days, the European Commission is quite keen on the construction of a European army, which is not necessarily part of NATO. Now, we know there's a certain amount of theatre to that, but I think that's an extraordinarily dangerous option, personally, because it adds to this sense of complacency and this paper tiger kind of concept that we're creating, rather than a real alliance, which we all know in the European continent is dependent upon the military capacity of the United States. Let's be absolutely clear about that. The idea that the Americans might leave European defence or reduce it in some way would be a total disaster for this continent. And I think it's about time we stopped bellyaching about the United States and complaining about US foreign policy and actually started to kind of realise who we really owe our national security to. So I think that would be my fundamental answer.
It's been interesting to see in the German elections now the way in which this 2% threshold is being politicized. And you're seeing the SPD come out against meeting the 2% hurdle, which, by the way, they were a part of the coalition government that agreed to it at Wales. I think part of this has to do with your typical SPD pacifism, Ostpolitik, and whatnot. Part of it, though, is a reaction to Donald Trump, in that this 2% hurdle has been so publicly identified with Donald Trump that it plays into the electoral gambit of the SPD, that they think that they can attack Merkel on this.
Thank you so much. Excellent seminar. And I also would like to say to our American friends, happy 4th of July.